In late October, the northern suburbs of Washington state began to transition into the cold season. The maple leaves turned red. The wind whistled softly through the rotten wooden fence. And the ashen skies seemed to reflect the mood of Ethan, a 19-year-old boy who had just returned from college to attend his father's funeral. David's death came suddenly, a stroke while working in the backyard. No goodbyes, no time to give instructions. Ethan received the news from a short phone call from Marianne at 2 in the morning, her voice trembling. Choking. Your father did not make it. The bus ride home was one of the longest journeys of Ethan's life. Not because of the time, but because the memories kept coming back without warning. He did not cry, not because it did not hurt, but because the emptiness in his heart was greater than tears. When the bus stopped in front of the road leading to the old house, Ethan stood still in the cold wind. The sky was gray, as if the world itself was dressed in mourning. The funeral took place on a drizzly morning. The small church on the edge of town was filled with a thick silence, as if all sound had been sucked into the void left by death. Ethan sat in the third row, his black coat soaked with rain, his hand clutching the eulogy book, but his eyes never left the front row, where Marianne sat. Motionless, she wore a long black dress, her hair tied back, no makeup, her eyes were sunken, wide and empty, as if she were looking through everything. She did not cry, did not tremble, just sat straight as a statue. The only movement was her hands, holding tightly to David's white handkerchief. Folded and worn, Ethan had never seen her like this. Marianne had been a woman with a light, airy laugh. Every time she saw him, she always asked if he had eaten, sometimes sneaking a few small cakes into his backpack before he returned to school. She did not step in between father and son, she always seemed to play a quiet role, taking a step back. But today, Marianne was no longer the gentle woman he had known. She was the clearest image of compressed collapse. And what confused Ethan the most, he did not know what to do with that gaze. A gaze that seemed to be lost, desperate but not strong enough to cry. When the funeral ended, Marianne stood still in the rain, as if she had no intention of leaving. The house felt strangely cold after the funeral, as if it had lost not just a person, but the breath that had kept it alive. Ethan walked in, leaving his wet shoes by the door, not turning on the lights. The dim light from the living room window was enough for him to see that everything was still in place. The pale gray sofa, the wedding photo of David and Marianne hanging on the wall, the round rug his stepmother had picked out online because it looked like poplar bark. Marianne sat in the chair, her funeral coat still on, her hand holding a cup of cold tea. Her eyes were fixed on nothing, just on the empty space between the two walls. Ethan paused, not knowing what to say. Are you hungry? She asked, her voice hoarse as if waking from a long dream. No, Ethan said softly. And you? Marianne didn't answer. Ethan walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Everything was still neatly arranged, as if time had stopped before David died. He saw an unfinished jar of jam, a carton of milk 3 days past its expiration date, and his father's coffee cup still on the dining table, coffee stains on the bottom. When he returned to the living room, Marianne had fallen asleep on the sofa, her head tilted slightly, her forehead furrowed as if she were dreaming something painful. Ethan sat down on the opposite chair. Outside, the rain had not stopped, and he knew this house would be cold for a long time if no one turned on the lights. Ethan woke up the next morning to a very faint sound, the sound of water running in the sink. He left the room to find Marianne washing the dishes with her bare hands. Surprisingly slowly, on the sink, 2 plates and a cup. She washed each dish as if it might shatter with a single breath. He said nothing, just leaned against the doorframe. Marianne's back was much thinner than before. Her black hair was tied back, revealing the white nape of her neck, where her sideburns were hanging down. Trembling in the early morning light, she paused for a moment, then said softly, I don't know what to do. Ethan, this whole house, every corner is him. He nodded. I know. That afternoon, Ethan sat in his old room, where he used to sleep in high school, holding his phone. His fingers swiping through the online learning portal interface. The document library was open, but he didn't read anything. His eyes kept glancing over the exam schedule. Then the unread email from the academic advisor. He opened a new tab. The school's website appeared. Ethan logged in, opened the deferred study section. His hand stopped at the line, reason for deferment. He typed slowly, word by word. Family reasons. Need time to take care of relatives. A small ding sounded as he pressed send. Everything had just become more real than ever. That night, over a simple meal, white rice and canned chicken soup, Ethan looked at Marianne and said, "I'll stay, at least for the rest of the winter." She raised her head, genuinely surprised. "I don't have to." "I know, but I want to." Marianne said nothing more. The chopsticks in her hand paused in midair. After a moment, she nodded, so slightly, as if she couldn't believe she had just been given something she didn't deserve. That night, Ethan sat alone on the porch, holding a cup of hot tea. The wind was cold, but not bitter. A long winter lay ahead of him, and he didn't know where it would lead. But he knew, if he didn't stay, there would be no one to keep the house from being swallowed by darkness. Ethan's first days back in the old house were like a dream without a name. Everything was so quiet that you could hear the ticking of the clock. No one spoke much. No one disturbed the fragile peace like ice. Ethan woke early in the morning, made himself coffee, often made an extra cup for Marianne even though he wasn't sure she would drink it. He left it on the kitchen table, then started sweeping the floor, wiping the windows, checking the old heating system whenever the temperature outside dropped below 5 degrees Celsius. Doing physical work helped him to take his mind off things, and in this house, taking his mind off things was the way to not be in pain. Marianne spent most of her time in David's study, where the desk was covered with technical papers, unfinished drawings, and an old swivel chair. She didn't arrange anything, just sat there, sometimes turning on the desk lamp but not reading anything. It was as if she needed light, but not words. One afternoon, Ethan walked into the kitchen and saw Marianne sitting there peeling an apple, the knife moving slowly and steadily, creating long, thin strips of skin like red-orange ribbons. He stood there watching for a long time. "Do you remember?" Marianne asked. "Your father said no one could peel an apple like that." Ethan nodded, but did not smile. "I remember." It was the first time she had mentioned David without bursting into tears. They ate dinner together in the evening, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about the news, the weather forecast, the cost of groceries. But Ethan gradually noticed something changing in Marianne's gaze, less absent-minded, less adrift. She stopped falling asleep on the sofa. She started closing her bedroom door at night. And on the 10th morning, Ethan woke for the first time to find the coffee he'd made the day before drained. One drizzly afternoon, Marianne entered the living room with a small wooden box. Without saying anything, she placed it on the center table and sat down in the chair opposite Ethan, who was reading a book. The box was locked with an old iron hook, without a lock, and could be opened with a slight turn. "These are my father's things," she said, looking down at her hands. "They are also remnants of the times we lived together as a family." Ethan put down the book. Inside the box were small items, an old wristwatch, a pen with David's name engraved on it, a few Polaroid photos, and a stack of faded handwritten letters. There was a photo of the three of them, David standing in the middle, his arms around the other two, his eyes sparkling. Ethan remembered that day, a short camping trip in the mountains near his house. The weather was exceptionally sunny. Marianne took out another photo. David bent over fixing a wooden chair on the porch, his face scrunched up in the sun. He always thought he could fix everything. She laughed, then paused, except for the invisible distances. Ethan knew she was referring to his relationship with David, never strained, but never close. They lived on parallel tracks, intersecting only once, when they broke up. "I don't think he knew how to be a father," Ethan said softly, "but I never doubted that he loved me in his own way." Marianne nodded, her eyes moist. "He tried, but sometimes adults carried too many wounds to hug someone completely." They sat in silence for a long time after that. Outside, the rain had stopped, but inside each of them, something had just broken, and was stitched together with the fragments of memory. Time passed in silence, as if the house and the two people in it had established their own rhythm, far from the outside world. And in that silence, Intimate moments began to arise, not loudly, not intentionally, but enough to make people's hearts tremble gently like the surface of an autumn lake. One evening, Marianne had a slight fever. Ethan knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He pushed the door open and entered, finding her lying on her side, her forehead red. The thin blanket had slipped off her body, her hand clutching the edge of the pillow. Ethan took a warm towel, gently wiped her forehead, then made a cup of honey and ginger water. She opened her eyes, looking at him dreamily. So much like him, she muttered. "Me?" Ethan asked, not sure he heard correctly. Marianne shook her head, closing her eyes. "I'm fine, thank you." The next day, when Marianne was well again, Ethan did not mention it again. But the way she looked at him was different from then on, something quieter. Quieter, as if searching for something in him that was lost. She started making coffee every morning, leaving a cup for Ethan. In the evening, she asked him what he liked to eat, and seasoned it carefully. Sometimes, they watched movies together, old movies that David used to like. Marianne sat at one end of the sofa, Ethan at the other, but at a touching scene, she turned and said, "Your father cried at this part. Remember?" And Ethan nodded, smiling. The distance between them then seemed to be connected by a fragile strain, vibrating with a name that was no longer there. Another time, when Ethan was taking things out to the yard to burn wood, Marianne called out from the window, "Wait." Then she ran out, quickly put on a sweater, and thrust a pair of old leather gloves into his hands. "Your father's. Don't let your hands get cold like his." Ethan took it, saying nothing, but as he turned away, he felt his heart constrict, not because of the words, but because of the tone, gentle, familiar, almost caring, to the point where he didn't dare to analyze it. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Marianne's eyes that had been dull with grief, but now began to light up whenever she looked at him. But the light wasn't like a stepmother's, and that scared him. Nothing happened, but he knew something was building. Slowly, gently, but dangerously close to being noticed. Winter came quickly, covering the windows in the house with a layer of frost. In the mornings, Ethan went out to gather firewood, his breath turning white in the cold air. He began to cook breakfast for them, turn on the fireplace early, and sometimes scheduled a mail for Marianne because she didn't want to leave the house. Marianne rarely left her bedroom, except for dinner and on sunny afternoons, when she sat on the porch, wrapped in David's old wool scarf, drinking ginger tea. But there was one thing Ethan began to notice: her eyes. It was no longer the blank stare of someone who had just lost someone. Nor was it the look of a stepmother looking at her stepson. It was a different look, as if she saw something new in him. Not simply missing David, not entirely grateful, but the presence of another person that made her heart begin to move. One afternoon, Ethan returned from shopping. As he entered the door, he saw Marianne standing in the hallway, facing the window, where the sunlight streamed straight down the long hallway. A warm yellow, she was wearing an old beige sweater, her hair loose. When she turned to look at him, she wasn't smiling, but there was something in her eyes that made him stop for a beat. "Did you get Earl Grey tea?" she asked, her voice casual. Ethan nodded, handing over the bag. She took it, but her hand lingered on his for a longer time than usual. Not on purpose, but not by accident either. The next time, that gaze became constant. When they cooked together, when Marianne poured tea, when she recounted old stories, and occasionally, pausing in the middle, her eyes looked at Ethan as if trying to figure out if he was still himself, or if some memory of David was resurrecting. Ethan began to feel short of breath in his own house. One day, as he was cleaning the windows, Marianne came up, standing very close behind him. "You're all grown up," she said, looking straight into his reflection. He nodded. "Yes, you used to say I was always mature beyond my years." She smiled, but didn't look away. "It's really different now, not a kid anymore." That night, Ethan sat in his room, the lights off, holding a cup of cold tea. The words from the day kept coming back to him, echoes in the closed space. He didn't know what to do. Nothing was clearly wrong, but things were approaching a gray area, where he wasn't sure if he could still maintain the boundaries, or if he was just pretending not to notice when they had blurred. Ethan began to avoid Marianne's eyes. Not out of hatred, but out of fear. There were looks that carried something so familiar, so gentle, that he felt like he was no longer the illegitimate child living in the old house, but someone else, playing a role he had not asked for. He woke up earlier, went for longer runs, and tried to come home later in the afternoon. He made excuses to read in his room, refusing Marianne's invitations to watch movies together. He even stopped touching her when she handed him things, or lingering too long when she smiled, because now, that smile was no longer as innocent as before. One night, Ethan woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of his bedroom window creaking in the wind. He turned on the light, then glanced out into the hallway through the crack. In the darkness between the two rooms, he saw Marianne's figure, standing there, silent, for some unknown period of time. He didn't say anything, and she didn't come in. A few seconds passed in complete silence, and then her shadow turned away. As light as a whisper. Ethan sat up for the next hour, unable to fall back asleep. He wrote in his notebook, "Not all warmth is love, and not all distances shortened come from understanding. There are things called loneliness that seek loneliness, and if we are not careful, we mistake it for love." That afternoon, the sky was overcast, as if foreshadowing the first snowfall of the season. Ethan was cutting firewood in the backyard when he heard Marianne calling from the porch. "Ethan," she said, her voice as light as the early winter wind. "I want to ask you something." He wiped his hands on a towel and moved closer. "I'm listening." Marianne held a stack of printed papers in her hands, reservations, routes, even a map of the small lake west of town. "I'm going to the cabin on Lake Constance. Your dad took me there a few years ago. I don't want to go alone." Ethan looked at the papers, then at her. "How long?" 3 days, 2 nights, she said, "just for a change of pace. I thought it might make us both feel better." He hesitated. The image of the small cabin by the lake flashed in his mind, a place of laughter, warm yellow lights, and the smell of new wood. But now, it was just a memory frame that Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to revisit. "I'm not sure we should go together," he said, his voice low. Marianne bowed her head. "I understand, but it's not because you need me to do anything. I just don't want to see myself reflected in the mirror again." Ethan was silent. There was something in her words, a weak, honest admission, that made it impossible for him to refuse outright. "I'll think about it," he said, and turned toward the back of the house. His back was soaked with sweat, despite the chilly wind. That night, Ethan opened the closet and took out his father's old scarf. Smelling the lingering scent of wood smoke, he looked out the window, where snow was beginning to fall lightly. And he knew, if he agreed, this trip would be more than just a change of pace. Ethan agreed after 3 days of silence. There was no long conversation, no promises or clear reasons. He simply set his backpack down on the seat by the door and said, "I'm ready." Marianne nodded. There was no triumph in that look, just an unexplained gratitude. They set off early in the morning. It was foggy. The ground was covered with a thin layer of snow, enough to make everything seem covered in a layer of silence. The car drove slowly along the winding mountain road, with thick pine forests on the left and a cold, dormant glacier on the right. Ethan sat in the driver's seat, Marianne beside him, wrapped in a thick coat and scarf. She turned on some music, old acoustic songs from the 90s that David used to like. The acoustic guitar played softly, as if echoing a time long gone. Neither of them said much, but the atmosphere was no longer as tense as it had been in the previous weeks. It was just empty. At noon, they stopped at a small roadside diner, one with a tilted wooden sign that read, "Hot soup in good silence." Marianne chose a table by the window, overlooking the snow-covered fields in the distance. "My dad used to sit right here," she said, twirling her spoon in her coffee cup. He ordered onion soup, and complained that it was too sweet. But he ate it all. Ethan chuckled. "Like my gingerbread." She looked at him. "Yeah, but he never complained about it." They finally arrived at the lakeside cabin in the late afternoon, nestled among tall pine trees. The house looked like a frozen slice of memory. The wooden door still creaked as it opened, and the old, though faded, scent of cinnamon candles lingered inside. Marianne turned on the heater and opened the curtains. The late afternoon light cast long streaks of orange against the wooden walls, bringing with it a sense of a brighter time. Ethan set down his backpack. The room was still divided into two single beds. The space cozy but redundant, like a painting without a third person. That night, they had dinner of pasta and wine. Marianne filled their glasses, then clinked them lightly with Ethan's. For the things that were never finished, she said. After dinner, they sat in armchairs near the fireplace, blankets draped across their laps. Outside, the snow fell steadily like deep breathing. Marianne told him about the first time David brought her here. He forgot his pajamas. Had to wear a coat all night. Ethan laughed, but his heart clenched, because the memory was now only half told. He looked at Marianne, her eyes lit up in the firelight. No longer sad, but strange. It was as if she were reliving an old life. And in that life, he was sitting in the exact same place as the person who had once made her heart flutter. Ethan turned away. Outside, Lake Constance was quiet, as if holding its breath waiting for something to happen. Night fell quickly in the lake. After 8 o'clock, the cabin was shrouded in darkness, with only the light from the fireplace casting a glow on the ceiling and the shadows of the trees swaying gently outside the window. Ethan sat on the bed, holding a book in his hand but unable to read a single line. The crackling of the firewood in the stove was like a countdown clock, making the already quiet space even heavier. Marianne emerged from the bathroom, her hair wet, wearing an old fur coat. She coughed softly, then sat down in an armchair by the fireplace, holding a cup of ginger tea. Ethan glanced at her, then looked away. In the flickering firelight, everything seemed to soften, even boundaries. "Aren't you going to bed early?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "I'll read a little." Marianne nodded, then paused for a long moment before continuing, almost in a whisper. "I used to think, if there was one thing that would keep your father here longer, it might be this place." Ethan didn't reply. He put down the book and sat up straight. He used to say it made him feel young again. Marianne smiled faintly, but she couldn't hide her tiredness. And every time he smiled, I forgot I was almost 20 years younger than him. A soft rumble of thunder sounded in the distance, a sign of an approaching snowstorm. The lights in the house flickered once and then went out. The only light in the room was the flickering firelight and the two of them breathing. "Don't worry," Marianne said. "It's just a power outage. It's common here." She took a candle from the drawer and lit it. The pale orange light bathed the room in a half-real, half-dreamy warmth. Ethan stood up and added more wood to the fire. When she returned, Marianne was sitting with her feet up, her robe slightly open, revealing her slender shoulders. She looked at him, longer than usual. "How do you feel about this place?" "Quiet," Ethan said dryly, "and something waiting to explode." Marianne nodded, then put her teacup down on the table. "I feel the same way." No one said anything more. A strong wind blew through the crack in the door, tilting the candle flame. Ethan stood up and said, "I'll go to bed. There might be a lot of snow tomorrow. We need to get up early." She just nodded. When he entered the room and closed the door, he didn't know whether to keep out the wind or to keep himself within a newly created boundary. That night, snow fell heavily outside and inside. The two of them slept in separate rooms, but their sleep was no longer completely peaceful. Snow fell all the next day. Ethan spent most of his time shoveling snow from the front porch and burning wood in the fireplace. Marianne did not leave the living room. She sat reading, occasionally looking up at the window, her eyes distant, as if searching for someone in the white storm. In the evening, they had an early dinner, chicken soup, bread, and hot tea. The air was quiet, gentle but stifling. Ethan avoided Marianne's gaze. She, on the other hand, seemed to look at him longer and longer, with a gentle gaze mixed with something that was no longer stepmotherly, and not quite a stranger either. After dinner, Marianne invited Ethan to sit by the fireplace. The snow was so thick that the windows were frosted. The wind beat against the walls of the house, whispering like a distant call. She poured wine, just one glass. Ethan refused. She did not force him. "I thought," she said after a moment, "that if one day no one needed me anymore, I would come back here. Stay alone." Ethan clasped his hands together. "I'm not alone. I have friends. I have a job. I have No one really has anything. Ethan, she interrupted, softly. I had someone. And now, there's just you. Silence fell like the snow outside, thick, soft, and numbing. Marianne turned to look at him. If you want, you can stay here with me. Not out of obligation, but because I believe, here. We don't have to play roles. Ethan froze. His heart was beating fast. But his eyes were steady. What are you saying? I'm saying, I need someone, not to replace your father, but to keep me from falling apart. Ethan stood up. He wasn't angry, but he was afraid of her gaze. Afraid of what he felt in his heart, pity, confusion, and a little wavering. You shouldn't have said that, he whispered. Marianne looked at him, unrepentant. You're not asking me for anything. It's just, if you felt the same way, you'd understand. Ethan shook his head. I'm not. Are you sure? She asked. Her voice as soft as a late spring rain. I never thought, if it weren't for you, I would have stayed longer? Closer? No, Ethan said, more firmly. I left because I needed to grow up. I came back because you needed help. Not because I needed someone to replace me. The air was thick. The fire was still burning. But they were both cold. Finally, Marianne stood up, nodding slightly. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said it. But when people are tired, they tend to forget their boundaries. Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving the floor. I understand, but I need to hold on to myself. Marianne put her hand on his shoulder. Very gently. Thank you for not leaving. And thank you for not staying. That night, Ethan did not sleep. He sat by the window, looking out at the snow-covered lake. In his mind was Marianne's eyes, and in his heart was a new void. Nameless, but clear. Not all intimacy leads to love, and not all love has a place to stop. The next morning, the snow had stopped. The first rays of the morning sun filtered through the pine needles, illuminating the wooden porch of the lakeside house. The lake was covered with a thin layer of ice that sparkled like broken glass. And everything around was as quiet as a sigh held back from a deep dream. Ethan woke up early. He packed up, folded his clothes, put away the used blanket, and checked his car keys. When he stepped out into the living room, Marianne was already sitting in the armchair, holding a cup of tea, her eyes looking toward the distant shore of the lake. She turned when she heard footsteps. Are you leaving so early? Her voice was not reproachful. Just a simple question like any other day. I think we should end here, Ethan replied. Marianne nodded, not objecting. I understand. Ethan approached, standing for a moment by the door, hesitating. Do you want me to take you home? She shook her head slightly. I'll stay one more night. Just one night, to make sure I've really said everything I shouldn't have. He didn't know what to say. There was something about that sounded like a blessing and a farewell. Marianne stood up and took a small wooden box from her pocket. Before he died, your father gave me this. He said if you came back, give it to me. I never dared to open it. Ethan took it, looking at the simply carved box, old but sturdy. Thank you. Marianne smiled. In any case, I'm grateful you came back, and that you knew when to leave. They didn't hug, just looked at each other one last time. No regrets, no blame. As Ethan left the house, his footsteps left long, diagonal tracks in the snow toward the small path leading out of the woods. The wind blew softly at his back, no longer cold, just wind. And behind him, the small house melted into the gray sky, like a dream that had hit rock bottom and now was sinking. 2 weeks later, Ethan returned to college in Seattle. Just as the snow melted in early spring, the city was busier after the holidays, and the campus was bustling with students. The sound of bicycles whizzing across the wet tiled sidewalks. He walked into his dorm, room 317 on the third floor, still the same, the desk by the window. The bookshelf slanted to one side, and the pale gray blanket he'd folded before leaving. But everything was different, not the room, the person who walked into it. Ethan opened his laptop, checking emails from the architecture department, class schedules, assignments, announcements for new labs. He found he could read them all without feeling lost. It was as if his mind had been cleared, or rather, ready to move on. Every morning, he walked to class through the trees that had yet to sprout leaves. Sometimes, the image of the cabin by the lake would flash through his mind, Marianne's eyes in the firelight. The gentle, ill-timed request, but he didn't let himself get lost in it. He remembered, but he wasn't stuck. One evening, he opened the wooden box Marianne had given him. Inside was a handwritten letter from his father, the familiar, clear handwriting, written in blue ink. He didn't read it right away. He just put it in the desk drawer, next to the measuring tape and the unfinished drawing. He knew there would come a better time to open it, but not now. He needed time, and for the first time, he allowed himself to take his time. Ethan began writing again, not blueprints, but short paragraphs, about a winter, a cabin, and two people learning to let go at the right time. He wrote not to publish, but to preserve something that had quietly changed him. Once, the professor asked, "What did you learn after the break?" Ethan replied, that not all broken things are losses. There are things that need to be broken so that we can move on. And the professor just smiled, as if understanding. There are lessons that only come from very cold seasons, and silences that no one teaches us how to name. Ethan opened the letter on a rainy evening. The patter of rain on the dormitory roof reminded him of nights spent in the lake house, the wind, the soft creaking of wood, and Marianne's eyes, silent in the fire. The letter was short, barely more than a page, but each line seemed to have been written in a mature silence. The tone was unpretentious. It was David's voice, deep, steady, and sincere. "Ethan, by the time you read this, I may no longer be around. Don't be angry if I leave you something that confuses you. I'm not a good person to express my feelings. You probably know that better than anyone. But there's one thing I've always tried to do: keep you whole. Before you even knew what whole meant. I know, I'm not a perfect father. There are days when I'm too quiet. There are times when I miss the chance to hold you, to ask you a simple question, are you okay? And then, time passes like the wind erases footprints in the snow. But I am always proud of you. Not because you are good at studying, or disciplined, but because you know when to stop, know how to keep going, even when no one tells you which way to go." About Marianne. If you read this after staying with her for a while, I just want to say, she is a good person. But grief can make people lose their way. If you ever feel like she has crossed the line, please do not be angry. Understand that sometimes people just want to hold on to what is left, even if it is the wrong person. At the wrong time. Forgive if you can, not because she deserves it, but because you need to be relieved. Son, do not let the pity for others make you lose yourself. Love with light, not darkness. And if one day you build a house, build it with your own hands. And your heart will no longer carry the old cracks. I will always be somewhere closer than you think. Dad. Ethan folded the letter and put it in the drawer. Outside, the rain was still falling. But inside, something had stopped. It was not sadness. It was the heaviness of a child who was once uncertain whether he was loved. Now he knew. Spring was slow in the old town. Ethan had come back for a short weekend, for a meeting with a lawyer about his father's estate. He hadn't planned to stay long, just stop by the old house, pick up a few old things, and then head back to Seattle for the day. The house, he'd guessed, was different. Marianne's car was gone. The fireplace was gone, and when Ethan opened the door and walked in, the house was so empty that every sound echoed loudly, like an attic that had not been lived in for a long time. In the living room, on a wooden table, was a book of poetry, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, that Marianne had kept by her bed. A sheet of paper was tucked into the middle page, where the poem had been marked. "I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles." There was no other note, no address, no goodbye letter, just the poem, and the absence. The neighbors said Marianne had left 3 weeks ago. Packed alone, didn't ask for help. The grocery store owner said she'd only bought one new suitcase, and that she was going somewhere where there's no snow, at least for a while. Ethan stood in his father's study, which had been filled with papers, now empty. On the table was a photo of the three of them, David, Marianne, and him on a camping trip years ago. He picked it up, turned it over, and saw Marianne's small handwriting. "Don't keep people behind when all they need is to leave with peace of mind." Ethan hadn't taken the photo. He'd left it where it was, then locked the door. When he stepped out onto the porch, a sudden spring rain was falling, soft, gentle, Like the final release of a relationship that no longer needed explanation. Marianne was gone. No fuss. No breakup. Just plain over. A year later, Seattle was ablaze with cherry blossoms blooming along the streets near campus. Ethan stood among the trees, sunlight streaming through his dark brown hair, his eyes no longer as lost as before. He was in his final year of architecture, interning at a small studio where he designed simple but light-filled homes. Home should be a place where you can breathe, he had written in his final paper. Not a place where you keep everything that's dead. He had lost touch with Marianne. He hadn't looked for her. He didn't care where she was. But every time he saw the first snow, or heard an old song his father had liked, he would remember, not with tears, but with peace. Ethan had begun writing 2 short stories about relationships that couldn't be named, about breakups that no one dared to say. He sent a few to the school's literary magazine. One was published. In it, he wrote, "There are people who pass by us not to stay, but to teach us how to keep ourselves. There are places that used to be homes, then became memories, and there are winters, no matter how cold, when the heart begins to sprout." One afternoon, while sitting in a familiar coffee shop, Ethan opened the drawer of his backpack and took out the old wooden box. His father's letter was still there, unopened, just kept like a silent compass. He smiled, not because everything was good, but because he was still moving forward, and this time, with his own footsteps. The following March, Ethan returned to Lake Constance, alone, unannounced. It was an unplanned trip, like a silent call from the past that he felt it was time to answer. The snow no longer covered the path. Only a few white patches remained on the tree trunks and the old tiled roof. The wooden house was still there, standing silently in the pine forest, covered in the dust of time but intact like a frozen memory. Ethan stopped the car, stepped out, and stood for a long time in front of the porch, not entering, just looking. The door still had a small crack next to the handle, a trace from the winter before. When he had opened it, entering a space filled with nameless things. He walked along the shore of the lake, where the water had thawed, reflecting the silver sky and the thin, slow-moving clouds. The wind blew gently through his collar, carrying the musty scent of the old forest. In his hand, he held an old notebook, containing unfinished writings from the days he stayed at home with Marianne. Ethan sat down on a rock by the water, opened the notebook, reread a few lines, then tore a page, folded it, and dropped it into the lake. The page floated away, spinning slowly, then sank. Goodbye, not because I forgot, but because I don't need to keep everything. On the way back, Ethan didn't look back, not because he forgot, but because everything needed to be left in its rightful place, like an old season that had passed. Like a person who had stayed, and like Ethan himself that year. And this time, his heart was calm enough to call everything by one name: memories. Ethan walked along the forest path leading away from the lake. The ground was covered with melted snow, revealing moist soil and a few green shoots emerging from the rotting leaves. The sunlight slanted through the leaves, creating shimmering spots of light on his shoulders. He was in no hurry. He carried nothing but a backpack and a notebook that had lost a few pages. But there was something in his steps that was different, no longer forced, no longer avoiding. He thought of his father, who had taught him to be silent with love. Of Marianne, who had been lost in loneliness. And of himself, who had wanted to keep everything, but now understood. Just keep what was right. A gentle wind blew. Ethan stopped, looked up at the sky, and smiled, a smile just enough. No farewells were heard. There was only a young man, walking in the spring, carrying winter in his heart like a part that had quietly turned into light. After listening to the story, what feelings do you carry with you? Do you sympathize with Ethan, with the journey of choosing between love and letting go? Or is there something in Marianne that makes you feel sad, because we all have been lonely in our own way? See you in the next story, where another heart is waiting to be told. And who knows, next time, that story might be a part of you. Team Daily Unexpected Stories.